The year is 1945. The Pacific theater of World War II has become a grinding war of attrition where every island, every beach, every bunker represents another chapter in one of history's most brutal conflicts. Deep in the volcanic rock of islands scattered across the vast Pacific Ocean, Japanese forces have constructed an elaborate network of fortified positions, bunkers carved into hillsides, and caves reinforced with concrete and steel. These defensive positions have proven nearly impregnable to conventional assault, costing Allied forces thousands of lives with each advance. But on this particular morning, as the tropical sun rises over the churning ocean, something new is about to change the calculus of this terrible war. The rumble of diesel engines echoes across the beach, and through the narrow observation slits of their bunkers, Japanese soldiers are about to witness a weapon that will shake them to their core. The flamethrower tank, a marriage of armor and fire, is rolling toward their positions, and nothing in their training or experience has prepared them for what comes next. If you're fascinated by authentic stories from history's most defining moments, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible true story. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his eye against the concrete observation slit, squinting into the harsh morning light that reflected off the black volcanic sand below. He had been stationed on this nameless island in the Marianas for 8 months, and in that time he had watched the inevitable American advance creep closer with each passing week. The bunker complex he commanded had been expertly constructed by military engineers, tunneled deep into the hillside with reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick and interconnecting passages that allowed his 50 men to move between positions without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The morning air was already thick with humidity, the kind that made uniforms cling to skin and turned every breath into a labor. Yamamoto could hear the distant rumble of naval bombardment, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past months. The Americans always began their assaults the same way, with days of relentless shelling from their battleships and cruisers, turning the island's surface into a moonscape of craters and shattered palm trees. But Yamamoto and his men had learned that beneath the earth, in their carefully prepared positions, they could weather even the most intense bombardment. Private First Class Kenji Matsuda crouched beside his commander, his rifle held ready across his knees. At 20 years old, he was one of the youngest soldiers in the garrison, drafted from his family's rice farm in Kyushu, and shipped across the Pacific with barely 3 months of training. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his weapon, not from fear, Yamamoto noticed, but from the constant tension of waiting, of knowing that the assault would come, but never knowing exactly when. The naval bombardment suddenly intensified, and the earth around them shuddered with each impact. Dust cascaded from the concrete ceiling, and the single oil lamp that illuminated their position swayed on its hook. Yamamoto had been through this before, on Tarawa and again on Saipan before being transferred here. He knew the pattern. The bombardment would reach a crescendo, then suddenly stop, and in that eerie silence, the landing craft would be racing toward the beach, packed with American Marines, ready to storm ashore. Through gaps in the smoke and dust, Yamamoto could see the landing craft approaching, their flat bows cutting through the surf. He raised his hand, signaling his men to hold their fire. Let them come closer. Let them think the bombardment had done its work. The Americans had overwhelming firepower, but they were predictable, and in that predictability lay the only advantage the defenders possessed. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka moved through the connecting tunnel from the adjacent bunker, his face streaked with dust and sweat. He was a career soldier, 15 years in the Imperial Army, and his weathered features bore the marks of campaigns in China and the Philippines. Where the younger soldiers showed anxiety, Tanaka displayed only a grim determination that came from having survived battles that had killed better men. "The Americans are bringing armor," Tanaka reported, his voice barely audible over the continuing bombardment. "Shermans, at least a dozen of them, but our position is strong. The anti-tank guns are positioned and ready." Yamamoto nodded. They had two Type 1 47mm anti-tank guns concealed in specially prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire. The bunker complex had been designed with American tactics in mind. The enemy would land their infantry, secure the beach, and then bring up armor to support the advance into the interior. But armor was vulnerable on these confined island battlefields, especially when forced to advance through narrow corridors defined by the terrain. The bombardment ceased with startling suddenness, and for a moment the only sound was the ringing in their ears and the crash of surf on the beach below. Then came the distinctive roar of landing craft engines as the first waves hit the beach. Through his observation slit, Yamamoto could see American Marines pouring out of the landing craft, running across the volcanic sand toward whatever cover they could find. His finger tightened on the trigger mechanism for the bunker's machine gun, but he held his fire. Patience. Let more of them commit to the beach. All along the hillside, other bunkers remained silent, their firing slits dark and seemingly abandoned. The Americans had learned to be cautious, having paid dearly for their lessons on previous islands. But they had a timetable to keep and commanders who demanded results. More landing craft hit the beach, and soon hundreds of Marines were advancing inland, moving in the practiced manner of men who had done this before, using whatever terrain features existed for cover. Yamamoto gave the signal, and the hillside erupted with fire. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions, their intersecting fields of fire creating a deadly crossfire that caught the advancing Americans in the open. Mortar rounds began falling on the beach, targeting the landing craft and the troops still coming ashore. The careful planning and preparation of months was paying off, and the American advance stalled as men dove for whatever cover they could find. But Yamamoto knew this was only the beginning. The Americans would call in airstrikes, more naval gunfire, and then they would come again and again until either the defenders were dead or the attackers had spent so much blood that they would be forced to withdraw. It was a calculus of death that both sides understood all too well. Hours passed in a blur of noise and violence. The Americans called in airstrikes, and the bunkers shook as bombs exploded on the hillside above them. But the positions held. The thick concrete and deep earth absorbing punishment that would have obliterated any surface fortification. When the bombing stopped, the Marines came again, and again they were driven back by withering fire from positions they could not effectively target. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Yamamoto allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They had held. The beach below was littered with destroyed landing craft and scattered equipment, and the Americans had withdrawn to consolidate their position on the beach itself. Tomorrow they would come again, but for today the defenders had prevailed. Private Matsuda was checking ammunition supplies when he noticed something different in the pattern of sounds from the beach. He moved to an observation slit and peered out, his eyes widening at what he saw. "Lieutenant Commander," he called out, his voice tight with concern, "there is something different coming." Yamamoto moved to look, and his blood ran cold. Rolling off the landing craft were tanks, but not the standard Sherman tanks they had prepared to face. These were modified, with strange protrusions from their turrets and what appeared to be additional armor plating. Even more disturbing were the trailers they towed, connected by armored fuel lines. He had heard rumors of such weapons, but had never seen one in combat. "Flamethrower tanks," Sergeant Tanaka said quietly, having come to stand beside his commander. "I saw them used in training exercises before the war. They are designed specifically for attacking fortified positions." The implications were immediately clear to every man in the bunker. Their advantage had been their fortifications, their ability to shelter from bombardment and fire from protected positions. But fire could reach where bullets and shells could not. Fire could flow through observation slits and air vents. Fire could turn their concrete sanctuary into a crematorium. The tanks began their advance up the hillside, their tracks grinding over the volcanic rock with inexorable purpose. They moved in formation, supported by infantry who used their armored bulk for cover. The anti-tank guns opened fire, their shells cracking through the air, but the flamethrower tanks proved surprisingly resilient, their extra armor deflecting shots that would have disabled a standard Sherman. One anti-tank gun scored a direct hit on a lead tank, and for a moment, hope flared among the defenders. The tank slewed to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, but the other tanks simply maneuvered around their disabled comrade and continued their advance. The message was clear. Even if they destroyed some of the attackers, others would get through. Yamamoto made a decision that went against every instinct of his training, every principle of Bushido that had been drilled into him since childhood. "Prepare to evacuate to the secondary positions," he ordered. "We cannot defend against this weapon from these bunkers." Some of the younger soldiers looked at him with shock. They had been taught that retreat was dishonor, that death was preferable to withdrawal, but Yamamoto had seen enough war to know that dying uselessly served no purpose. If they remained in these bunkers, they would be burned alive, and their deaths would accomplish nothing. If they withdrew to the cave system deeper in the island's interior, they could continue to resist, to extract a price for every foot of ground the Americans took. Sergeant Tanaka began organizing the withdrawal, moving men through the connecting tunnels toward the rear exits that opened into the ravines behind the hill. They moved quickly but methodically, taking weapons and ammunition, leaving behind only what they could not carry. Through the observation slits, they could see the flamethrower tanks drawing closer, their crews scanning the hillside for targets. The first burst of flame came without warning, a jet of liquid fire that shot from one of the tank's projectors and engulfed the entrance to a neighboring bunker. The screams that followed were mercifully brief, but would haunt the memory of every man who heard them. The flame found its way through the firing slits and air vents, turning the concrete structure into a furnace. Men who had survived months of bombardment died in seconds, their bodies consumed by fire that reached temperatures of over 2,000 degrees. "Move!" Yamamoto ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. They could not help the men in the other bunkers now. All they could do was save themselves and live to fight another day. The evacuation proceeded with practiced efficiency, squads of men filing through the tunnels while a rear guard maintained token resistance to cover their withdrawal. Private Matsuda was among the last to leave, pausing at the tunnel entrance to take one final look at the position they had defended so stubbornly. The flamethrower tanks were methodically working their way along the hillside, their terrible weapons reaching into bunker after bunker. The volcanic rock itself seemed to glow with the heat, and the smell of burning fuel mixed with the sickly sweet odor of burning flesh. He turned and ran, following his comrades into the darkness of the tunnel system. Behind him, the bunker complex that had taken months to construct and had seemed impregnable just hours before was being systematically destroyed by a weapon against which concrete and steel provided no meaningful protection. The cave system into which the Japanese troops withdrew was a natural formation, expanded and improved by military engineers during the months of preparation before the American invasion. Here, deeper in the island's interior, the tunnels twisted and turned through the volcanic rock, creating a maze that would be nightmarish for attackers to navigate. The defenders knew every passage, every turn, every position prepared for defense, but they also knew that this was their last refuge. There was nowhere left to retreat. Yamamoto established his command post in a large natural chamber near the center of the complex. A small generator powered a radio set and a few electric lights, though he ordered them used sparingly to conserve fuel. Water seeped from the walls in places, enough to sustain the garrison, but not enough for comfort. The air was thick and humid, difficult to breathe, and he knew it would only get worse as more men crowded into the confined spaces. "We held them for one day," Sergeant Tanaka observed as he organized the defense of the cave entrances. "One day, more than many predicted we would manage." Yamamoto nodded, but there was no satisfaction in the achievement. Outside, the Americans would be consolidating their hold on the beach and the surrounding terrain. They would bring up more troops, more supplies, more of those terrible flamethrower tanks, and eventually, inevitably, they would come for the caves. That night, as exhausted men tried to find space to sleep on the rocky floor of the caves, Yamamoto sat with his back against the cold stone wall and allowed himself to think about things beyond the immediate crisis. He thought about his wife and daughter waiting in Hiroshima and wondered if they were safe from the American bombing raids that he knew must be ravaging Japan's cities. He thought about the rice paddies of his childhood and the cherry blossoms that would be blooming in the spring, though he would never see them again. Private Matsuda found him there, the young soldier's face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes still alert. "Sir," he said quietly, "may I ask a question?" Yamamoto gestured for him to sit. "Speak freely. Why did we withdraw?" The boy's voice held no accusation, only genuine confusion. "We were taught that to retreat is to betray our duty, to dishonor ourselves and our families." The lieutenant commander was silent for a long moment, considering his response. "Because dead men cannot fight," he finally said. "Because throwing away our lives in a gesture of defiance serves no purpose beyond satisfying abstract notions of honor. We withdrew because here, in these caves, we can continue to resist. Every day we hold, every casualty we inflict, serves a greater purpose. That is the duty we owe to our comrades, who have already fallen." The boy seemed to consider this, his young face thoughtful in the dim light. "But we cannot win, can we, sir? No matter how bravely we fight, no matter how many Americans we kill, in the end, they will overrun this position just as they have overrun every other island." Yamamoto felt the weight of that truth settle over him like a physical burden. "No," he said quietly, "we cannot win this battle. But perhaps if we fight hard enough, if we make the cost high enough, we can help win something larger. Perhaps we can convince the Americans that the price of invading Japan itself would be too terrible to contemplate. Perhaps we can force a negotiated peace that preserves something of our nation and our way of life." It was a thin hope, and both men knew it, but it was all they had. The American assault on the cave system began 3 days later. The interval had been filled with constant bombardment as naval guns and artillery pounded the hillsides, trying to collapse the cave entrances or at least weaken the defenders' resolve. But the volcanic rock was solid, and the caves ran deep. The garrison endured, rationing water and food, breathing air that grew progressively more foul, waiting for the inevitable. When the attack came, it followed a pattern that was becoming grimly familiar. Infantry probed the cave entrances, supported by tanks that could not enter the narrow passages but could provide covering fire. The defenders fought from prepared positions, firing from behind barricades constructed of sandbags and rock, then withdrawing deeper into the cave system when pressure became too great. But the flamethrower tanks changed everything. Unable to enter the caves themselves, they positioned themselves at the entrances and fired their terrible weapons into the darkness. Liquid fire flowed through the passages, seeking out defensive positions, forcing the defenders to abandon positions they might otherwise have held indefinitely. Men who had faced bullets and artillery shells without flinching broke and ran when faced with that wall of flame advancing through the tunnels. Sergeant Tanaka organized fighting withdrawals, keeping his men together, preventing panic from turning retreat into rout. He moved from position to position, his voice calm and steady, reminding the younger soldiers of their training, keeping them focused on the immediate task rather than the larger hopelessness of their situation. When a passage became untenable, he would oversee the withdrawal to the next prepared position, ensuring that weapons and wounded were brought along, that no man was left behind while he still lived. The fighting in the caves became a nightmare of smoke and flame, of men groping through darkness, broken only by the flash of gunfire and the terrible orange glow of burning napalm. The wounded could not be properly cared for, and their cries echoed through the stone passages. Water became scarce, then precious, then critically short. Men's lips cracked and bled, their throats parched, their bodies weakening from dehydration even as they continued to fight. Private Matsuda found himself separated from his unit during one chaotic withdrawal, trapped in a side passage with two other soldiers when the main tunnel was cut off by fire. They waited in darkness, listening to the sounds of battle echo through the stone, trying to decide whether to risk the flames or wait and hope for the fire to burn itself out. In the end, they chose to wait, huddled together for comfort as much as warmth, sharing their last canteen of water in tiny sips. It was Matsuda who noticed that the sounds of battle were growing more distant, that the Americans seemed to be withdrawing. He crawled to the passage entrance and peered cautiously around the corner. The tunnel was filled with smoke and the smell of burning fuel, but the flames had died down, leaving behind a hellscape of charred rock and smoldering debris. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some clearly Japanese, others American Marines who had pushed too far into the caves and been cut off. The three soldiers made their way carefully through the devastated tunnel, checking each body for signs of life, recovering weapons and ammunition from the dead. It was grim work, made worse by the heat that still radiated from the scorched stone walls, but it was necessary. Every rifle, every hand grenade, every round of ammunition might make the difference in the next engagement. They found Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto in what had become the final command post, a chamber deep in the cave system where the remaining defenders had gathered. The garrison that had numbered 50 men when they first withdrew from the bunker complex now counted less than 30 effectives. The rest were dead, wounded too seriously to fight, or missing and presumed dead in the collapsed passages and smoke-filled tunnels. Yamamoto's uniform was torn and blackened with smoke, and a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm showed bloodstains from a wound he had not mentioned. But his eyes were still clear, still focused on the task at hand. He was organizing the remaining men into 3 squads, positioning them to defend the approaches to this final position. "We cannot retreat further," he told his assembled men, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation, but still carrying the authority of command. "Behind us is solid rock. Before us are the enemy and the fire they bring, but we still have weapons, we still have ammunition, and we still have our duty. When they come again, we will make them pay dearly for every foot they advance." The men listened in silence, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and deprivation, but their hands steady on their weapons. They had come through hell and emerged on the other side, and if they were to die in this dark stone tomb, they would at least die as soldiers, taking as many of the enemy with them as possible. But the American assault, when it resumed, did not follow the expected pattern. Instead of another wave of infantry supported by the flamethrower tanks, the defenders heard a different sound, a mechanical grinding and scraping that seemed to come from above. For a moment, they could not identify it, and then with dawning horror Yamamoto understood. "They are using explosives and excavation equipment to dig down from above," he announced. "They intend to breach the chamber from the ceiling." It was a tactic against which there was no defense. The garrison could hold the tunnel entrances indefinitely, but if the Americans simply dug through the rock above them, they would be trapped like rats in a barrel. Sergeant Tanaka moved to stand beside his commander, and for the first time, the old soldier's face showed something like despair. "We could surrender." he said quietly, the words clearly costing him greatly to speak. The Americans, they do take prisoners. I have seen it. They treat them according to the conventions of war. Yamamoto considered this, knowing that every man in the chamber was listening, waiting to hear what he would say. Surrender had never been presented as an option in their training. The code of Bushido held that death was preferable to the dishonor of captivity. But Yamamoto had seen too much death, had lost too many men, to cling unthinkingly to abstract principles, while concrete death approached from above. Any man who wishes to surrender may do so, he said finally. I will not order it, but neither will I condemn those who make that choice. For myself, I will remain here and fight until the end. But each man must decide for himself what his duty demands. The soldiers looked at each other uncertain, torn between their training and their survival instinct. Private Matsuda stood, his rifle in his hands, his young face showing a maturity that had been earned through fire and blood. I will stay with you, sir, he said, not because of honor or duty, but because you stayed with us when you could have saved yourself. That is worth something, I think. One by one, other soldiers stood, making their choice. Some chose to fight on. Some chose to take their chances with surrender. Yamamoto divided their remaining supplies equally, giving those who chose to surrender their share of the dwindling water and food. When the time came, they would approach the American lines with hands raised and white flags made from torn uniform shirts. It was a chance, at least, which was more than those who stayed behind would have. The grinding sound from above grew louder, and then the ceiling of the chamber began to crack. Dust and small stones cascaded down, and the defenders could see daylight through the growing fissure. Yamamoto ordered his remaining men into position, weapons trained on the ceiling, waiting for the breach to open fully. When it came suddenly. A section of ceiling collapsed, showering the chamber with rock and debris, and through the gap poured smoke and the distinctive smell of napalm. But instead of the immediate burst of flame the defenders expected, they heard a voice, amplified by a megaphone, speaking in heavily accented Japanese. Soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, the voice called, you are surrounded and cut off. You have fought bravely and your courage is recognized, but further resistance is pointless. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have my word as an officer. Yamamoto looked around at the faces of his men, seeing his own exhaustion and resignation reflected there. They had fought for days, had lost 2/3 of their number, had endured bombardment and flame and the terror of fighting in darkness. They had done their duty, more than their duty. What more could be asked of them? He stood, letting his rifle fall to the ground, and raised his hands. Around him, one by one, the other defenders did the same. Through the breach in the ceiling, American soldiers descended on ropes, their weapons ready but not firing. They moved quickly to secure the chamber, checking the Japanese soldiers for weapons, administering first aid to the wounded. An American officer, a Marine captain with dirt-stained utilities and a face lined with the same exhaustion the defenders felt, approached Yamamoto. He said something in English, then tried again in broken Japanese. You fight well, hard fight, over now. Yamamoto nodded, unable to speak, feeling the weight of defeat settle over him like a physical burden. The captain seemed to understand, gesturing for him to sit while a medic attended to his wounded arm. Around the chamber, other American soldiers were helping the Japanese wounded, sharing water, offering cigarettes. The violence was over, replaced by a strange camaraderie between men who recognized in each other the shared experience of combat. As he sat there, having his wound dressed by an enemy soldier who treated him with surprising gentleness, Yamamoto thought about the flamethrower tanks that had driven them from their bunkers, that had hunted them through the caves, that had ultimately forced their surrender. He thought about how the nature of warfare was changing, how weapons were being developed specifically to overcome the tactics and fortifications of previous conflicts. The lesson was clear. No position was truly impregnable, no defense was permanent. All that remained was the courage of the men who fought, and the choices they made when courage was no longer enough. Private Matsuda sat against the stone wall, an American soldier's canteen in his hands, drinking water in great gulps that hurt his parched throat. He thought about his family's rice farm, about whether he would ever see it again, about what awaited him as a prisoner of war. He thought about the men who had died in the bunkers and the caves, and about how close he had come to joining them. And he thought about Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, who had chosen to preserve the lives of his men when preservation was possible, even at the cost of his own honor and reputation. Outside, on the beach where the battle had begun, American engineers were already at work, constructing the infrastructure needed to support the next phase of operations. The island that had cost so many lives to capture would become a staging point for strikes deeper into Japanese-held territory. Each island a stepping stone toward the ultimate objective of Japan itself. The flamethrower tanks, having proven their terrible effectiveness, were being serviced and refueled, prepared for the next assault, the next island, the next group of desperate defenders who would face the same choice that Yamamoto and his men had faced. The war was far from over, and there would be many more battles, many more deaths before the final reckoning came. But for the survivors of this particular engagement, Japanese and American alike, the fighting was done. They had learned lessons about the nature of modern warfare, about the limitations of fortifications against innovative weapons, about the choices men face when caught between duty and survival. These lessons, paid for in blood and fire, would echo through the remaining months of the war and beyond, shaping the tactics and strategies of conflicts yet to come. As night fell over the captured island, the prisoners were led down to the beach, where a ship waited to transport them to a prison camp. Yamamoto walked at the head of the column, his back straight despite exhaustion and defeat, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light of day was fading into darkness. Behind him, his men followed, survivors of a battle that had already begun to fade into the larger narrative of the war, another small island taken, another defensive position overcome, another step closer to the final end. The flamethrower tanks sat silent on the beach, their deadly work done for now, waiting for the next time they would be needed, the next time their terrible weapons would prove the futility of static defense against an enemy with superior technology and unlimited resources. They represented the future of warfare, a future where no position was safe, no fortification impregnable, where the only certainty was change and the constant evolution of methods for killing and destruction. In the prisoner transport ship, as it pulled away from the island, Yamamoto stood at the rail and looked back at the volcanic slopes that had been his world for the past months. Somewhere in those hills were the bunkers where his men had first made their stand, the caves where they had fought their last battle. Somewhere in the dark earth were the bodies of those who had not survived. Japanese and American alike, united in death by the war that had brought them to this remote speck of land in the middle of an endless ocean. He thought about the flamethrower tanks and the lesson they taught. Technology would always advance, new weapons would always emerge, and those who failed to adapt would pay the price. But some things remained constant. The courage of soldiers, the bonds formed in combat, the weight of command, and the burden of deciding who lives and who dies. These were the eternal truths of warfare, unchanged by technological innovation, unaffected by the passage of time. As the island disappeared into the darkness behind them, Yamamoto turned away from the rail and moved into the hold where his men waited. They looked to him for leadership still, even in captivity, and he would not fail them. They had survived when so many had not, and that survival demanded something of them. They would endure their imprisonment, would live to see the war's end, would carry the memory of what they had experienced and witnessed. And perhaps, in the years to come, when the war was long over and the ruins had been rebuilt and the dead had been mourned and honored, they would tell their stories. They would speak of the battle for a nameless island, of the bunkers that had seemed impregnable until the flamethrower tanks came, of the choices men face when survival demands the abandonment of everything they have been taught to value. These stories would be their testament, their way of ensuring that those who died had not died meaninglessly, that the lessons paid for in blood would not be forgotten. The ship steamed on through the night, carrying its cargo of prisoners toward an uncertain future. Behind it, the island was already being transformed, its scars covered over with the machinery of war, its strategic value realized as American forces prepared for the next assault, the next island, the next step in the slow, grinding advance across the Pacific. In the cramped hold of the transport ship, the Japanese prisoners sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, salt water, and diesel fuel. Guards stood at the exits, their weapons held loosely but ready. Yet there was no hostility in their bearing, only a kind of weary professionalism that came from men who had seen too much death to take pleasure in the suffering of defeated enemies. Private Matsuda sat with his back against the cold metal wall of the hold, his eyes closed, but his mind unable to rest. Images kept flooding back to him. The moment the first flamethrower burst had engulfed the neighboring bunker, and the terrible screams that had followed. The face of Corporal Yoshida, a farmer from his own prefecture who had been caught by the flames in one of the cave passages and whose charred remains they had found during their retreat. The look in Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto's eyes when he had given the order to surrender, the weight of that decision visible in every line of his face. Beside him, Private Nakamura, a quiet young man from Osaka who had worked in his family's textile factory before the war, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they will kill us? The Americans. I have heard stories about what happens to prisoners." Matsuda opened his eyes and looked at his companion. Nakamura's face was gaunt, his cheeks sunken from days of inadequate rations and constant stress. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the thin blanket the Americans had provided. "No," Matsuda said with more confidence than he felt. "If they wanted to kill us, they would have done it on the island. The American officer gave his word that we would be treated according to the conventions of war. But what does that mean?" Nakamura persisted. "What will happen to us?" Before Matsuda could answer, Sergeant Tanaka's voice cut through the murmur of conversation in the hold. "It means we will be sent to a prison camp, probably in Hawaii, or perhaps on the American mainland. We will be given food and shelter, and we will work, but we will not be mistreated. The Americans, for all their faults, generally follow the rules of warfare when it comes to prisoners." Several heads turned toward the sergeant, men seeking reassurance from his veteran's authority. Tanaka sat with his back straight, despite the exhaustion that must have been weighing on him, his face composed, presenting an image of calm competence that the younger soldiers desperately needed. "And after the war?" another soldier asked. "What happens to us then?" Tanaka was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with truth he could not soften. "That depends on how the war ends, and when. If Japan surrenders, we will eventually be repatriated. If the war continues for years, we may remain prisoners for a very long time, and if Japan fights to the last man, as our leaders have promised." He left the sentence unfinished, but every man in the hold understood the implication. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto had been sitting apart from the others, his wounded arm cradled against his chest, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Now he stirred, and when he spoke, every man fell silent to listen. "The war will end," he said quietly, Perhaps not this year, perhaps not next year, but it will end. Japan cannot sustain this level of loss indefinitely. The Americans have resources we cannot match, technology we cannot counter. What we saw on that island, those flamethrower tanks, they are just one example of what is to come. Each weapon we develop, they develop two to counter it. Each island we fortify, they find a way to overcome our defenses. But sir, a young private interrupted, his voice trembling with emotion, are you saying that all those men died for nothing? That all our sacrifice was meaningless? Yamamoto turned to look at the young soldier, and his expression softened. No, he said firmly, not meaningless. Every day we held that island, we kept those American forces occupied. Every casualty we inflicted was one less soldier they could send against the home islands. We did our duty, and we did it well. But duty does not require us to die uselessly when death accomplishes nothing. We are alive because we chose survival when survival became possible. That choice took more courage than dying would have required. The hold fell silent again as the men absorbed this. It was a radical departure from everything they had been taught, from the warrior code that had been drilled into them since childhood. Yet coming from Yamamoto, a decorated officer who had proven his courage in multiple campaigns, it carried a weight that could not be easily dismissed. On the deck above, the American Marine captain who had accepted Yamamoto's surrender stood at the rail, smoking a cigarette and watching the phosphorescent wake trail behind the ship. Captain James Morrison had been in the Pacific for 18 months, had participated in 4 amphibious assaults, and had seen more death than any man should have to witness. The battle for the island, which would receive some meaningless numerical designation in the official records, had been his most difficult command yet. They fought well, a voice said beside him. Morrison turned to see his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who served as the company's interpreter. Yes, Morrison agreed, flicking his cigarette into the dark water. Too well. We lost 43 men taking that island, 43 Marines dead for a piece of rock that most Americans couldn't find on a map. It had to be done, Chen said. The island controls the approaches to the next objective. Without it, the fleet would be vulnerable. Morrison knew this was true, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the weight of command or the memory of the men who had died under his leadership. Good men, men with families waiting for them at home, men who would never see another sunrise or feel the touch of a loved one. And for what? A strategic objective that would be obsolete the moment the next battle began. What will you tell their families? Chen asked quietly. When you write the letters. Morrison had already written draft after draft in his mind, trying to find words that could somehow make the loss bearable. That their sons and husbands and fathers had died bravely, that their sacrifice had served a purpose, that they had not suffered. All of it true, and yet all of it inadequate to the enormity of what had been taken from those families. I will tell them the truth, Morrison said finally. That their loved ones died doing their duty, that they were brave to the end, and that I am sorry. What else can I say? Below decks, the Japanese prisoners were settling into the routines of captivity. Guards brought food, simple fare of rice and canned vegetables, but more than they had eaten in days. Water was freely available, and men drank until their shrunken stomachs could hold no more. Medical corpsmen moved among the prisoners, treating wounds, distributing medicine, showing a professional competence that transcended the language barrier. Private Matsuda accepted a bowl of rice from one of the guards, a young Marine who looked barely older than himself. Their eyes met briefly, and Matsuda saw his own exhaustion reflected in the American's face. How strange, he thought, that men who hours ago had been trying to kill each other could now coexist in this confined space with something approaching civility. He thought about his family's rice farm, about the endless cycle of planting and harvest that had defined his life before the war, His father had not wanted him to go, had argued that farmers were essential to the war effort and should be exempt from conscription. But Matsuda had felt the pull of duty, the social pressure that made it impossible for a young man to remain behind while others went to fight. How foolish that seemed now, sitting in the hold of an enemy ship, defeated and captive, his future uncertain. Sergeant Tanaka was speaking quietly with a group of younger soldiers, and Matsuda moved closer to listen. The sergeant was telling a story from his time in China before the Pacific War had begun, about a battle where his unit had been surrounded and had fought its way out against overwhelming odds. It was a story of courage and determination, but also of the randomness of survival in combat, of how death could come for the bravest and spare the coward, of how luck mattered as much as skill or courage. The point, Tanaka concluded, is that being alive is not shameful. We did not surrender because we were cowards. We surrendered because our situation was hopeless, and further resistance would have accomplished nothing except to add our names to the list of the dead. Some will judge us for that choice. But those who judge were not there, did not face what we faced, did not have to make that terrible decision. The younger soldiers nodded, drawing strength from the sergeant's words. They needed to believe that their surrender had been justified, that they had not betrayed their comrades or their country. The alternative was to sink into despair, and despair served no purpose. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto sat apart, his mind far from the cramped hold and the gentle roll of the ship. He was thinking about the strategic implications of what he had witnessed on the island. The flamethrower tanks represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. For centuries, fortifications had been the backbone of defensive strategy. A well-constructed fortress could hold off forces many times its size, could control territory far beyond its physical footprint. But the flamethrower changed that calculus. Fire could reach into spaces bullets could not penetrate, could flow through the narrow openings necessary for ventilation and observation, could turn any enclosed space into a death trap. If the Americans were deploying these weapons throughout the Pacific, then every island fortress, every cave complex, every prepared defensive position was suddenly vulnerable. The strategy of extracting maximum casualties from each American advance, of making them pay in blood for every foot of ground, would become exponentially more costly for the defenders. The mathematics of attrition, already unfavorable to Japan, would become impossible. And if these weapons could be deployed against island fortifications, what would prevent their use against the home islands themselves? Japan's cities were built of wood and paper, highly vulnerable to fire. If the Americans developed aerial versions of these incendiary weapons, they could turn entire cities into infernos. The thought was almost too terrible to contemplate. He needed to find a way to get this information to the Imperial Command. They needed to understand that the defensive strategy they had adopted was obsolete, that new approaches would be required if Japan was to have any hope of negotiating a favorable peace. But how could a captured officer communicate with his superiors? The Americans would never allow it, and even if they did, would his superiors listen to the words of a man who had surrendered rather than fight to the death? The night wore on, and gradually the prisoners fell into exhausted sleep, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated fatigue of days of combat and stress. Only the guards remained awake, watching over their charges with a mixture of vigilance and something that might have been pity. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold, Lieutenant Morrison stood at the rail and watched the horizon. Behind him was an island taken at terrible cost. Ahead lay more islands, more battles, more young men who would die far from home. The war ground on with its own inexorable logic, consuming lives with mechanical efficiency, and Morrison could see no end to it. He thought about the Japanese commander. the one who had surrendered his remaining forces rather than fight to the last man. There had been something in the officer's eyes, a depth of experience and understanding that transcended the language barrier. This was a man who understood the true cost of war, who had made the hardest decision a commander could make, accepting the shame of surrender to preserve the lives of his men. Morrison respected that. In the heat of battle, it was easy to be brave, easy to order men forward into danger when your blood was up and the enemy was in your sights. But to make the cold calculation that further resistance was futile, to accept defeat and captivity, to bear the weight of judgment from those who would call it cowardice, that required a different kind of courage. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist, and the ship steamed on toward its destination. In the hold, the prisoners began to stir, waking to another day of captivity and uncertainty. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto opened his eyes and for a moment forgot where he was, his mind returning to the comfortable home in Hiroshima where his wife and daughter waited. Then reality crashed back, and he remembered. The island, the flames, the surrender, his new existence as a prisoner of war. He stood, wincing at the stiffness in his wounded arm, and moved to the porthole. Through the thick glass, he could see the endless expanse of the Pacific, the same ocean he had crossed to come to this war. Somewhere beyond that horizon was Japan, and home, and everything he had been fighting for. Would he ever see it again? Or would he die in captivity, just another casualty of a war that had already consumed millions? Private Matsuda woke to find Sergeant Tanaka standing over him. "Get up," the sergeant said, not unkindly. "The Americans are bringing breakfast, and then they want to process us, record our names and ranks for their records." The processing took most of the morning. One by one, the prisoners were brought before a table where American officers recorded their information through the interpreter, Lieutenant Chen. They were asked their names, ranks, units, and where they had been captured. The questions were perfunctory, and the Americans showed little interest in extracting military intelligence. This was simply bureaucratic necessity, the machinery of war, creating records that would follow these men through their captivity. When it was Yamamoto's turn, he stood before the table with as much dignity as he could muster. Lieutenant Chen asked the questions in careful, formal Japanese, and Yamamoto answered truthfully. There was no point in deception, and besides, his honor demanded honesty even in defeat. "You commanded the garrison on the island?" Chen asked, his pen poised over the form. "Yes," Yamamoto confirmed. "I was the senior officer present after the original commander was killed in the preliminary bombardment." Captain Morrison, who had been observing the interviews, leaned forward. "Ask him about the flamethrower tanks," he said to Chen. "Ask him what made him decide to evacuate the bunkers." Chen translated the question, and Yamamoto considered his response carefully. "We had prepared for conventional assault," he said finally. "Artillery, naval bombardment, infantry attack. Our bunkers were designed to withstand those threats. But the flamethrower tanks, they changed everything. Fire flows like water, finding every opening, every weakness. There is no defense against such a weapon when you are in an enclosed space. To remain in the bunkers would have been to die without purpose, so I ordered evacuation to the cave system, where we could continue to resist." "And in the caves?" Morrison pressed. "Why did you surrender when you did?" Yamamoto met the American captain's eyes directly. "Because you were digging through the roof of our final position. Because we had no water left and our ammunition was nearly exhausted. Because my men had fought bravely and accomplished everything that could be accomplished. And I saw no reason to waste their lives in a futile last stand." He paused, then added quietly, "I know this may be difficult for you to understand, but I believe I made the right choice." Morrison was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand better than you might think. War is about achieving objectives, not making empty gestures. "You fought well, Commander. You cost us dearly. But when the outcome was inevitable, you chose life over pointless death. There is no shame in that." The respect in Morrison's voice was unmistakable, and Yamamoto felt something unknot in his chest. He had made the right choice, and even his enemy recognized it. Perhaps that was all the vindication he could hope for. The processing continued through the afternoon, and by evening all the prisoners had been documented. They were given clean clothes, simple grey uniforms that marked them as prisoners of war, and allowed to shower for the first time in weeks. The simple pleasure of hot water and soap was almost overwhelming, and more than one man stood under the spray longer than necessary, letting it wash away not just the dirt and grime, but some of the accumulated trauma of the past days. That night, as the ship continued its journey, the prisoners gathered in the hold for their evening meal. The food was simple but adequate, and men ate with the single-minded focus of those who had gone too long with too little. After the meal, as the guards dimmed the lights and prepared for night watch, Sergeant Tanaka began to speak. He told stories of Japan before the war, of festivals and cherry blossoms, of the everyday life that had once seemed so ordinary, but now felt impossibly distant. He spoke of his village in the mountains, where his family had lived for generations, of the changing seasons and the ancient rhythms of agricultural life. Other men joined in, sharing their own memories, creating a tapestry of recollection that helped them remember who they had been before the war had transformed them into soldiers and now into prisoners. Private Matsuda talked about his family's rice farm, about the backbreaking work of planting in the spring and the satisfaction of harvest in the fall. He spoke of his younger sister, who had wanted to become a teacher, and his mother, who made the best miso soup in the prefecture. As he talked, he could almost see their faces, could almost feel the warmth of home. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto listened in silence, his own memories too painful to share. He thought of his wife, Akiko, and their daughter, Yuki, who had been only 5 years old when he had left for the war. She would be 7 now, perhaps 8, depending on how long his captivity lasted. Would she even remember him? Would his wife have given him up for dead and moved on with her life? These were the questions that haunted the quiet moments, the fears that could not be spoken aloud. And beneath all of it was the larger question of what would become of Japan itself. The war was going badly. Anyone with eyes could see that. Each month brought news of more territory lost, more cities bombed, more ships sunk. How long could Japan sustain such losses, and what would happen when the inevitable end came? The ship sailed on through the tropical night, carrying its cargo of defeated soldiers toward an uncertain future. Above deck, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human struggles unfolding beneath them. The war would continue, more battles would be fought, more islands taken, more lives lost. But for these men, the fighting was over. Now came the harder part, the long wait through captivity, the struggle to maintain hope and dignity in the face of defeat and uncertainty. And somewhere on that same ship, Captain Morrison lay in his bunk and tried to sleep, haunted by the faces of the 43 Marines who would never sail home. He had done his duty, had accomplished his objective, had followed his orders. But the cost weighed on him like a physical burden, and he knew it was a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. War reduced everything to its simplest elements: who lived and who died, who won and who lost. But the reality was far more complex, far more nuanced. Victory and defeat were not simple categories, but spectrums, and every man on that ship, victor and vanquished alike, carried scars both visible and invisible that would mark them forever. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the ship approached its destination. The prisoners were roused and assembled on deck, blinking in the bright tropical sunlight, seeing for the first time the island that would be their home for the duration of the war. It was larger than the one they had defended, with barracks visible on the hillside and a substantial dock facility. "This is where your war ends," Lieutenant Chen told them through his translation. "You will be housed in those barracks, you will work on various labor details, and you will be treated fairly according to the rules of war. Obey orders, do not attempt to escape, and you will survive to see your homes again." The prisoners filed down the gangway, their legs unsteady after days at sea. Guards formed them into ranks and marched them toward the camp, and with each step, their former lives receded further into memory. They were no longer soldiers, no longer warriors defending their homeland. They were simply prisoners now, waiting for a war to end that they could no longer influence, hoping to survive long enough to see whatever future awaited them on the other side of peace.